Well, good day and welcome to the second sermon in our Vision series. It's brought to you on video today as the recording this morning didn't work out, unfortunately. And you might remember that we're in the process of thinking about our vision as a church and particularly keeping us on track for what we want to do together as a church. If you've forgotten, our kind of statement that holds us together is that we want to be a church that is multiplying churches of flourishing disciples where Jesus is Lord and people are loved. That multiplying churches, that's not to say, just to clarify something that came up last week, that's not to say that we want to see lots of other churches multiplying, as good as that is. And in fact, we want to be praying for churches all across Tassie, across the world, and even in Hobart, even in the northern suburbs, we want to be praying for lots of churches. What we mean by we want to be multiplying churches is we ourselves want to grow to a point of new believers that are being trained, raised, and discipled, that we ourselves start a new church somewhere where a church is needed. That's what we mean by multiplying churches. Flourishing disciples, we talked a lot about that last week, where Jesus is Lord and people are loved. And today's sermon, that's the one we want to focus in on, where people are loved. It's an important part of discipleship. It's an important part of church life. If you see the body of the disciple, we looked at that last week. We kind of got 5 key areas that we think we would want to be flourishing as disciples. We've got that maturing in our mind and knowledge of God. We've got the magnification where we're speaking out God's goodness and the glory, and we're going to be focusing on that one next week. We've got ministry where we're serving one another. We've got mission, which is about reaching the lost with the good news. But today we want to focus on that heart one, the love one, the membership one, where we belong to one another. And when I think about the word love, I think, is there a topic sung about more than this topic of love? I don't think so. I mean, if I was to start, I will always, everyone would finish, love you, Whitney Houston, 1992. I just called to say, I love you, Stevie Wonder, 1984. Or Elvis Presley, I can't help falling in love with you. Now, most songs are about romantic love, of course, but not all of them. For example, Lean on Me by Bill Withers, a famous song, is not about love, romantic love, it's about friendship. And the song by Stevie Wonder, Isn't She Lovely, is actually about the birth of his daughter. And of course, Dear Mama, 1995 by Tupac, was a tribute to his mother, celebrating her sacrifice despite hardships. And gosh, don't we know he gave her some hardships. Love is an easy target for songs, for poetry, and for movies. And when love is going good, it's great, isn't it? But when it's going bad, it's horrible. And I reckon love is under threat in our society today. We're seeing more and more transactional relationships where people do give and receive affection based purely on personal gain or fulfillment. We're seeing a fear of vulnerability that leads to shallow relationships, emotional walls, a lack of deep, authentic connection. We're finding instant gratification where people immediately want needs met without the cost of patient and long-term love investment. But increasing is commitment phobia, unrealistic expectations, miscommunication, hurt, jealousy, anger, rage, violence, weaponizing. We are a generation dealing with the hurts and pains of those that have gone before us, who have not loved us as they ought. And now, as a society, we may be doing the same thing. After all, hurt people, don't they? Now, when it comes to us, the church, love is still no small matter, is it? Jesus set a vision for his followers as individuals and as a community, the church, to be marked by love in every dimension. He built a new kind of community, like a beacon of love that would stand out in a world often defined by division, self-interest, and conflict. The church, in Jesus' eyes, was to be the engine room of sacrificial, selfless love. A selfless love that fueled every relationship, every action, every mission. But what happens when the church, rather than being that engine room of love, becomes something else entirely? Christians are not, and I'm sure you know this, but Christians are not immune to broken love. I want you to imagine now a community built upon hostility, where grudges are nursed instead of forgiven, divisions fester rather than heal, where greed and self-interest begin to creep into our hearts, turning the church into a place where personal agendas overshadow God's agenda. Well, that's not love. And the tragic reality is that a church like that repels instead of attracts. It divides instead of unites, and it wounds instead of heals. The very place meant to reflect God's love ends up becoming a mirror of the world's brokenness instead. Now we know that's not the way it's meant to be, and Jesus knew that was a threat. So rather than simply inviting us to love one another, he goes one step further. Jesus does not merely invite us, he commands us to love. Why don't we look together at John 13? Actually, I'll pick up the reading from verse 33. Jesus is speaking to his disciples and he says, "My children, I will be with you only a little longer. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews. So I'm going to tell you now, where I'm going, you cannot come." Jesus continued, verse 34. "A new command I give you, love one another, just as I have loved you. So you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." Here we are with his death looming. Jesus begins to prepare his disciples for his departure. He speaks of being glorified, a reference to the suffering he is about to endure on the cross, which is going to lead to his resurrection and eventual return to his Father in heaven. The disciples cannot go with him there. They're going to remain behind on the earth, entrusted with carrying on this love mission that he sets before them. And you see, the mission and vision of the church is not merely to grow, as we talked about last week. We want to grow, but we've also got to show. We've got to show love. There is no point bringing people into this kingdom, growing in numbers, and then leaving people to suffer, to go it alone, to feel lonely and isolated. No, the church is meant to continue on the love mission Jesus set before us. Disciples must love. Flourishing disciples are going to abound in love. And that's part of our vision and part of our mission. Now, a new command, Jesus says. He says, love one another. But is this a new command? Let's read verse 34. He says, "A new command I give you. Love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another." At first glance, it doesn't appear that this command is new. I mean, after all, the command to love is found in the Old Testament consistently, particularly Leviticus 19:18, which calls God's people to love your neighbor as you love yourself. It's not new love. So what is new about this love that Jesus is commanding here? Well, it's a new standard. It's a new depth of love. If Leviticus says love as you love yourself, Jesus says love as I have loved you. In other words, in the same way that I've loved you, Jesus says, you've got to love one another. Jesus is calling his disciples to love not just with any kind of love, but with that same selfless, sacrificial love that he himself time and time again demonstrated. This is a love that goes beyond mere affection or simply kindness. It's not just a nice word to somebody. It's a love that humbles itself to serve, just like Jesus did when he washed his disciples' feet earlier in the chapter. It's a love that lays down its life for others, as Jesus is about to do the very next day from when he spoke to his disciples. Self-sacrificial love. So the newness of this command lies in the example that Jesus sets. In fact, he is raising the bar of love to a higher place than perhaps his disciples had ever known. And that's the love he calls us to as well, isn't it? A selfless, a self-denying sort of love. You know, I think of the 14th century. I'm not really good with history, but work with me here. In the 14th century, there was the bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, and it swept across Europe, even killing a third of its population. But history records that while many people fled the cities to avoid infection, Christians chose to stay behind, to care for the sick and the dying. They provided food, comfort, and even buried the dead. They gave acts of mercy that few others were willing to do because it was risking their life. Well, in this day and age, we might call that heroic. Jesus would say, "Well done, good and faithful servant. You obeyed my command to love as I have loved." That's a self-sacrificial sort of love that Jesus has set before us. Well, in verse 35, Jesus even says something more exciting with one of the most profound and simple reasons why we should love. Have a look at me with verse 35. Jesus says, "By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." In verse 35, Jesus then says something quite exciting and extraordinary regarding this selfless love. It's one of the most profound and simple reasons why we should love in this way. Have a look with me at verse 35. He says, "By this," and I presume he's talking about the love he's just spoken of, "by this sort of love, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." I wonder, can you hear the missional heart within this command? The way we as a church love one another is not just about building a strong community within. It is actually one of the means by which the world will recognize who Jesus is. Jesus is telling his disciples, and I think he's telling us too, that our love for one another will be the defining mark of our identity in him. Do you want more people to know Jesus? Well, love one another. Our careful and kind love for one another will make the gospel visible, tangible, real in the eyes of those who are searching for hope, truth, and real love. Christian love for one another is one way the unseen God is making himself visible to the world. And keep in mind, this world is struggling to find true love. And Jesus is saying, hey, you love one another the way I've loved you, people will find true love. Look, City North Church, and anyone who's listening here online, I want to say this. Imagine a church where love defined the people and revealed Jesus to the lost and unbelievers in such a way that people wanted to know more about Jesus. I wanted to say, imagine this, but actually I don't need to, because I've heard people say exactly this about our church, that City North are a loving people. I love it when I hear stories of someone in our church having someone else over to their house for dinner. Hospitality is this kind of selfless love. I love hearing where a meal has been dropped off to a sick person or a person who just can't cook for themselves at this point in time. Or someone's gone for a chat or a walk together. That's selfless love. Someone said to me, I just walked into your church and I just felt something. I feel it every time I go there. Hey, that's love. Another man came up to me on the street just this week and said, Marty, I've been hearing people at the bus stop talk about that church thing you guys are doing and how they feel loved and looked after when they go there. Well, folks, that is love. It is Jesus. It's Jesus being expressed in the selfless love that we are giving to one another. It's a one another love, not just a me love. You know what I mean? So be encouraged. This part of our vision, that people are loved, this part of our mission, it's on fire. It's going great. And as we are doing, let's keep doing it. Let us stoke that love zeal even more with this selfless, kind love, a love that gives and yet doesn't expect anything in return. I wonder if you've been challenged and encouraged to love more deeply as you hear this. We do want to be multiplying churches. We want to be flourishing disciples. We want Jesus to be our Lord. And specifically today, we want to know that people are loved and that we, as being disciples, are loving more and more. And I know that sounds like a very short sermon, but I'm actually going to hand it over to Kerry. Kerry, who is overseeing that part of our mission to ensure that we are loving one another more deeply. She's what we call our membership coordinator, the engine room of our love. It's probably why we're doing so well in this area, because she is so good at it. But Kerry's going to now share a little bit about what City North's membership focus is really all about. I'll hand it over to her.